Good evening, colleagues, friends, mentors, students, visitors, family members. Welcome to the presidential address at this, the 118th meeting of the American Anthropological Association. This year, the CASCA AAA annual meeting. We're so happy to be here. I'm Ed Lebo, the Executive Director of the American Anthropological Association, and it's my distinct honor to introduce to you the President of the Association, Dr. Alex Barker. Alex is the Director of the Museum of Art and Archaeology and the Director of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of Missouri, and he has been the president of the association for the past 2 years. 2 years before that, the president-elect vice president, and it has been my distinct pleasure to serve with Alec for all this time. And he is going to talk this evening about the predatory present. I give you Alex Barker.
Thank you, Ed. Good evening. For the benefit of anyone watching who is visually impaired, I am a white male, overweight, middle-aged male with gray beard, gray hair, and a blue suit. And so everyone is aware, we do have CART and ASL. Anthony F.C. Wallace, and here at this joint CASCA AAA meeting, I should probably note that he was himself a Canadian-American anthropologist. In a delightful lecture to our own Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, suggested that all communities have atlases for eternity, maps of sacralized or meaningful time. It's striking in that regard that English has no good term for this construct, this string of successive sacralized events ranging from creation myths through more immediate and lived experience that structure, constrain, and inscribe events in characteristic ways. He uses a specific term which I find problematic, and so here I will replace his term of historia with narratio. Narratio, for my purposes, signifies the ways in which cosmology, myth, and history interact to create a community's intrinsic and unique understanding of how time unfolds, and hence how events occur. Communities often have more than one narratio operating in parallel and are constantly juggling and negotiating between different narratio in different contexts. I choose that term for a couple of reasons. First, it sidesteps some of the baggage that accompanies terms like historicity, as Charles Stewart has recently noted, or historia, as Wallace suggested, both of which implicitly or explicitly invoke questions regarding the actuality or validity of that temporal ordering, the literal hiaceity of past events. Terms like historicity now have so much baggage that Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has suggested we attach numbers to the term to clarify which of several meanings we intend in any particular setting. Here I'm less concerned with the specificity of a sequence than the rhetoric of how time is assembled and presented in general, and hence I prefer a term rooted in rhetorical strategy. Second, and reflecting this, the narratio is, on the one hand, the telling of events in a rhetorical rather than strictly historical context, and on the other, a purposeful presentation that enmeshes the listener in a particular way of seeing or understanding. While there are a multiplicity of narratios, Wallace suggests there are three main modes: cyclical time, linear time, and terminal time. Cyclical time is just what the name suggests. Time unfolds as a series of cycles, either literally or metaphorically repeating and recombining. The ancient Americas are replete with examples of cyclical time on a grand scale, and the Mayan interlocking cycles of Tzolk'in, Hab, and Long Count are perhaps the most glorious example. But many other societies and communities, including much Asian thought as well as Hesiod's Greece and Rome, employed their own mythic cycles that overlapped with and informed other calendrical formats. The second mode is linear, in which time flows like a river from one point to the next. Wallace points to various communities in Australia and sub-Saharan Africa as having linear temporalities, linear narratio. Fabian viewed this as the West's secular view of time as well. And much of Newtonian science is premised on the idea of time as a linear dimension, especially as a linear dimension that can be measured in standardized units. That combination of linearity and standardization is not necessary, however, and Mayan time, for example, uses equally and in some respects more precise standardized units within a cyclical narratio. A third mode is terminal time, a genre that presumes time has an inherent and intrinsic end, both in the sense of a conclusion and often in the sense of a teleological purpose. Ragnarok, Götterdämmerung, Armageddon, and the Apocalypse all spring to mind, all as end times, and normally, but not always, with a didactic doomsday rather than descriptive character. As Wallace notes, the dominant religious traditions of the Western world all postulate unilinear time from a creation to a redemptive but utterly destructive ending. And dogmatic Marxism could probably be added as a secularized version of the same underlying temporality and narratio. The world ends sometimes with a bang, sometimes with a whimper, but usually because of what we in the museum business would call inherent vice. Fabian identified this kind of terminal time as characteristic of religiously focused Western thought until the Enlightenment. 2 notes. First, I am not suggesting that these are the only ways cultures and communities organize time, but Wallace's categorization is useful in considering the ways in which our own presentist approaches apprehend the idea of the past. And second, I would repeat Wallace's astute observation that while Newtonian cosmology assumes linear time, modern non-Newtonian physics embraces versions of all 3 of these modes, a point to which I'll return in a few moments. Like time itself, the present is a slippery construct, a seemingly natural concept that's almost impossible to pin down in either practice or theory. Each moment of the present is endlessly slipping into a series of successively more distant pasts, eroding under our feet more quickly than each can be apprehended, much less understood and described. There's certainly no shortage of anthropological studies of time, and many of us came of intellectual age reading works like Barbara Tedlock's Time and the Highland Maya, Alfred Gell's The Anthropology of Time, Cultural Constructions of Temporal Maps and Images, Hughes and Troutman's Time, Histories and Ethnologies, or Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places, Landscape and Language Among the Western Apache, among many others. And I would argue that the last is every bit as much about time as it is space. But probably the most influential anthropological work on time remains Johannes Fabian's Time and the Other, How Anthropology Makes Its Object. At its heart, Fabian's critique is that while ethnographic fieldwork takes place in shared time, in its writing it creates a temporal distance that privileges the ethnographer, and by extension the ethnographer's cultural practices, over an artificially created, schizogenically constructed other. For Fabian, while we write the communities and individuals we study into a fictive and static past, we reserve for ourselves a dynamic and active present. While I find Fabian's critique compelling, I'm not convinced that the requirement of coevalness must necessarily constrain all anthropological writing into what is, in reality, an equally artificial present, but rather that, at least in the case of ethnography, we must acknowledge and share the same time. To the degree that we're making sense of action or utterance or anything other than static forms, we're already implicating temporal progression and situating our inquiry inherently within time past. But in the context of contemporary intellectual discourse, it would be hard to imagine that coevalness as anything other than the present. The present is the unmarked linguistic category, and it's become in equal parts presumed and predatory. Scholars at the interface of philosophy and history have traced the rise of presentism as both an ontological assertion that only the present is real and as an instrumentalist assertion that, either in addition or as a result, only the present matters. François Hartog, for example, has identified 5 distinct regimes of historicity in Western thought, albeit some coexist at any given moment. First is a heroic regime, echoing Marshall Solon's treatment of Hawaii's discovery of Europeans, followed by a Christian regime of historicity stretching from incarnation to a presumed redemption. It coexists with a didactic emphasis on the past, a pastism, if you will, which Hartog identifies with the Ancien regime. With the Enlightenment comes a shift, an emphasis on the future that constitutes the transition to modernity and brings with it a valorization of change, of novelty, of progress. For Hartog, those changes are embodied in how Chateaubriand understood the New World, and how in the space of a quarter century he shifted from seeing the Americas as a refuge for those living in harmony with nature, a museum or utopia of the past, into a crucible where the future was being forged. To this point, Hartog's work closely follows that of Reinhard Koselleck, who tracks the same changes in Western historical imaginaries and dubs this transitional period a Sattelzeit, or epical shift, ushering in modernity. For both Hartog and Koselleck, these periods mark changes in how the lived present experiences and negotiates the balance between the space of experience, hence the past, and the horizon of expectation, or the anticipated future. The shift to modernity constitutes a reversal of didactic direction. Instead of the past guiding and informing the present, the Historia Magistra Vitae, in modernity, the future and the horizon of expectation become the guiding force and influence of the present. That modernist regime of historicity, that modernist narratio, survived until the 20th century and died in the tumult of 2 world wars and the Cold War's gradual thaw. For Hartog, the temporal disjunction is marked by the end of spatial disjunction, by the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. But in reality, it was a century-long process, and Marinetti's futurism at the beginning of the 20th century itself presaged the end of modernism, emphasizing less an inchoate future than a raucous, violent, and ever-accelerating, ever-imminent present. Over the course of the 20th century, the gulf between experience and expectation widened until the present no longer mediates between experience and expectation. Both are subordinated to a predatory present that exists only for itself. Hartog writes, "Such are the traits of this manifold and multivalent present, a monstrous time. It is at once everything, there is nothing but the present, and almost nothing, reduced to the tyranny of the instant. Today, enlightenment has its source in the present, and the present alone." This is presentism, a regime of historicity, a narratio in which only the present exists meaningfully, where and when past and future become resources to be exploited for present profit. It is the presentism of the endless news cycle, of fake news, and the echo chamber. And I don't believe it detracts from Fabian's critique to suggest that we now distance the other by placing those with whom we work into an artificially static past while remaining ourselves in an equally static and theoretically problematic present. The literature on presentism is considerable and growing rapidly, and its effects can be seen across multiple disciplines and dimensions of intellectual inquiry. Here, let me simply note 2, because I'd like to return to them later. First is a shift over the course of the latter half of the 20th and beginning decades of the 21st century in our terminology, and how we as archaeologists and museum anthropologists speak of our subject. Sites, artifacts, and ecofacts slowly gave way to cultural resources and cultural material, and these in turn gave way to heritage, to the salience of the past and the present. Or to put it another way, discourse about the past became discourse about latter-day resources about the past, which gave way to appropriation of those resources by the living as heritage. In the process, subject and object, the past and its traces, were drawn together into an inescapable present. History witnessed a similar shift over the same period, and through the work of theorists like Hayden White, history is reviewed less as a res gestae of past events, but rather as a series of stories in and for the present that created rather than reconstructed the past. Instead of a dialectical relationship where past is unpacked and examined by a present constantly mediating between experience and expectation, past became a product, or rather a byproduct, of the present. and we reap the whirlwind. To be clear, I'm not talking here about presentism as a methodological choice, as a conceptual framing device used to illuminate specific knowledge practices which might otherwise be overshadowed or swamped by what Ringel has called past fixation, but rather with the broader presumption of presentism as paradigm. And that paradigmatic presentism is transdisciplinary, affecting all of the social, comparative, and historical disciplines. In Wallace's terms, that presentism becomes a terminal mode of narratio, in which past and future have the present as their end. And like most terminal narratios, there's a quasi-religious, dogmatic, and unquestioning element in the teleological subordination of past and future to an omnipresent present. Now, all of this begs the question, what, or rather when, is the present? Now I hear some of you mutter, surreptitiously checking your phones for dinner reservations. But by the time I ask the question and you hear it and frame your reply, through the linearity of utterance, if nothing else, the words are already said, already slipped into the past tense, already slipped into the past. The present is evanescent, transitory, endlessly eroding, and becoming a proximate past instead of a present present. The present is a difficult concept for physics and metaphysics alike, and the broad outlines of the debate can be traced back to antiquity, to Heraclitus and Parmenides, the former arguing that time passes and reality is always in flux, the latter that reality is timeless and unchanging. Heraclitus' view that things change gave rise to presentism and to some alternatives. Parmenides' view that past, present, and future are all equally real and unchanging gave rise to eternalism. Presentists and eternalists make competing claims about ontological reality. Presentism presumes that only the present is objectively real and that only things currently present, currently actual, exist. Hence, neither past nor future are real. Eternalism claims that past, present, and future all exist, and all existence in time is equally real, but struggles with accounting for an indeterminate future. Hence, eternalism carries with it the presumption that the future is already existent and hence potentially knowable. Neither is terribly satisfying. A third way, which as a non-specialist I find preferable, is what's sometimes called growing block theory, which holds that the present is a way we experience the unfolding of time and space, the wavefront of becoming, with a succession of past presents, the past, as real and existent entities in its wake and expanding into a not yet real future. Such a perspective allows three things that I think are important. First, it allows us to point to a real and existent past, which I think is crucial and necessary not because I'm an archaeologist and I want the past to be real, but because I think denying its reality and existence has ethical implications which I find problematic. Second, while it allows for a real past to which we may have real and recognizable obligations, it simultaneously allows an indeterminacy to the future, which I find appealing, and in troubled times like these, somewhat hopeful. Presentism denies the reality of both past and future. Eternalism presupposes a symmetric reality of the past and future, which necessarily makes one too vague or the other too certain, or both. Finally, growing block theory allows for positionality, for the reality that we meaningfully and genuinely experience the past in different ways, without presupposing an infinite series of pasts giving rise to an equally infinite series of presents. In its current paradigmatic form, presentism combines its traditional ontological assertion that only those things currently present are real with a curious suppression of the constant flux and progression of time, which was its hallmark in antiquity. On the one hand, the present recreates and recapitulates itself using the resources it mines from the past and the future, both subordinated to the present as their teleological end in a reversion to a terminal mode of narratio. But on the other hand, neither past nor future is held to exist. The result is less change than churn. While I take a certain perverse, or at least dilatory pleasure in plunging down the rabbit holes of the philosophy, physics, and ontological metaphysics of time, I will not take you with me. I've brought you this far only to underscore 2 points. First, the logic of paradigmatic presentism is simply this: we do not directly know the past. We did not ourselves experience slavery, say, or the First World War, or soon anyway, the Bengal famine of 1943 or the Holocaust. We know of these things only secondhand, and the past is thus a continual creation of the present. Triot makes this point eloquently and concludes that as a result, we never succeed our past but remain its contemporaries. And at one level, that's true. We constantly revise, review, revisit, and rewrite our understanding of the past. That is to say, histories and culture histories, and that process is very much in the present. But conflating those histories with the past itself is, I think, a logical fallacy of a very familiar kind. Yes, nothing is better than eternal happiness, and yes, a ham sandwich is better than nothing, but it does not thereby follow that a ham sandwich is better than eternal happiness. The terms are not equivalent any more than it's equivalent to treat the past and our histories of the past as being identical and isomorphic. We do not succeed our histories, they are contemporary with us, but that does not make the past itself a contemporary creation. It's the inherent fact that the past and our histories of it are not the same that allows the past to contradict, to confound, and to correct histories that ignore the subaltern or suppressed voice, that gloss over the silences and hegemonic processes that individual histories record and enact. And if that reductionist, presentist view were both adequate and accurate, we'd have exactly the same problem with the present. We have direct knowledge of only a vanishingly small set of events and experiences, and for the most part, our knowledge of the world around us is based on hearsay. In fact, by that standard of evidence, we're limited to our own first-hand experience. Even the experience of consociates with whom we share the same spatial and temporal community is unallowable, much less that of contemporaries who share neither. This implies a radical Cartesianism that I find equally indefensible and unpalatable, as it warrants the kind of endless redaction and denial of the real, lived experience of the past to suit current tastes and to glibly refute inconvenient truths that characterizes, among other things, current American political discourse. Second, part of presentism is a deceptively just and welcome emphasis on the obligations we owe to the living. Over the past century, we've seen a gradual and necessary shift in our orientation to first acknowledge and then, with grudging slowness, embrace our obligations to descendant communities and to the partners with whom we work. And while I think presentism may have accelerated that needed and overdue process, and I'm happy to acknowledge that fact, it comes with a high cost yet to be reckoned. Because presentism not only insists that we have ethical obligations to living communities, it also insists we have ethical obligations to them alone. Because the past isn't real, does not exist, we have no meaningful ethical obligations to past individuals or communities. They are not subject to harm or to change, to affect or to influence, and since our actions can't affect them, we can have no moral obligations to them as unreal and non-existent entities. According to that narratio, the past is a story by and for the present, and it exerts no claims on us ethically. That seems to me like adding quite a bit of grease to an already slippery slope. The growing block theory allows us to view the past as real, even if our positionality, our perspective varies. And if we accept the past as real, we certainly can and do have obligations to it, because we can and do change it, at the very least in the form of extrinsic or relational changes, what are sometimes called Cambridge changes, which can be most narrowly defined as changes to the descriptions truly borne by that entity. Even those who feel we can only apprehend the past through the lens of the present should accept the reality of such extrinsic changes. My mother's mother died before I was born, but she nevertheless became my grandmother at my birth. The past is clearly subject to those kinds of minimal Cambridge changes, if nothing else. That's why the distinction between the past and our stories about the past is vital, because the existence of a real past allows our relationships to it to meaningfully change. Let me add that I don't happen to believe that purely extrinsic Cambridge changes are the only ways in which we can potentially affect the past, but that's a topic for another day. My point here is simply that presentism, both as a narratio and as an ontological construct, rejects the reality of such entities and hence any obligations to them. But once we accept the past's reality, then our obligations are equally real and demonstrable. Now, I suppose that one apparent advantage of presentism is a sense of boundedness, that our obligations are limited to living individuals who might reasonably hold us to account. Suggesting we have ethical obligations to past individual and communities might seem to open a Pandora's box of limitless obligations to a past we cannot fully know. Geertz's distinction between consociates and contemporaries, predecessors and successors, may be useful in this regard. Itself an adaptation of Alfred Schutz's phenomenology, consociates share a temporal and spatial community, while contemporaries do not, due to social or spatial distance, although they do nominally share a physical or absolute temporality. Geertz departs from Schutz in relaxing that division between present and past, in recognizing that predecessors from the past may also be contemporaries or even consociates as well, although successors, what Geertz calls unborn occupants of an unarrived future, cannot. As we become increasingly aware of and familiar in all senses of the term with past individuals and communities of their haesiety instead of their quiddity, our obligations to them increase, as do our obligations to consociates of any other kind. Unless we accept a very strong version of positivism and believe that had we but wit enough and time, all things would be inherently and intrinsically knowable, and with that accept the epistemic headaches of Fitch's knowability paradox, then Pandora's box remains firmly shut. Presentism might at first blush seem to address Fabian's critique that we place the other into a fictive, subordinate temporality as part of the colonizing enterprise. It does not, and I would submit it does exactly the opposite. Fabian's thesis that geopolitics relied on chronopolitics for the West to expand remains equally accurate and apropos, but the ways in which this control is exerted in the presentist age have changed. By denying its contingency, presentism also denies its complicity in a past it would rather forget, and can forget because it denies its intrinsic existence. Through presentism, those same hegemonic structures are preserved and promoted by endlessly perpetuating the present in which they already dominate, while denying the reality of the past through which they came to be. Let me end by repeating three key points, the central arguments of my own philippic against presentism. First, that while Fabian's trenchant critique requires that we and those with whom we work and whom we study be coeval, it does not, I think, inherently require that this coevalness be fixed in some artificially constructed present. We can share that past in which the relationship actually occurred. Transposing our construction of anthropological knowledge and the reality of past interactions with others into an artificial, unchanging, and constantly recapitulated present that denies its own contingency and perpetuates its own hegemony neither resolves nor addresses the historically situated concerns that Fabian identified. Second, the trend toward presentism in the social sciences and humanities broadly defined is marked by a change in emphasis from studying the past to studying heritage, the salience of the past in the present, and represents or reflects a regression to a terminal mode of historicity, of temporality, in which the past is subordinated to and exists as a construct for the present. In other words, the end of the past, in a teleological sense, has become the present, and as a result, we create a series of notional pasts only to colonize them with systems suiting our own interests and agendas. This is a terminal mode of temporality that brings with it all of the faults of the religiously based terminal narratios that preceded it, without the fig leaf of a promised redemption, or even the meaningful likelihood of progress. And third, the idea that only the present meaningfully exists entails, on the one hand, that we have a responsibility to living peoples and communities for what we do, but it also means that those are our only meaningful obligations. It argues that our obligations to the dead are vested exclusively in those still living, existing only as long as there are living communities to whom we're accountable. I find that logic troubling and have struggled with its implications for many years, and I can't reconcile it with what I believe are our foundational ethics and disciplinary obligations. Surely our obligations cannot be extinguished so easily and we need to recognize an obligation to people remote from us based in some manner on distance, rather than drawing an arbitrary distinction based solely on whether that distance from us is reckoned in spatial or temporal terms. The limitations of these constructs are evident, but what's only now emerging through the diverse and challenging work of a range of scholars is a different and more promising appreciation of time, of the construction of knowledge, and of the production of culture, less concerned with and entangled in the present than with a more dynamic process of becoming, one that embraces the flow of experience and the contingent nature of change. Because of that contingent quality, such an appreciation requires an explicit acceptance of a real and vibrant past. I would submit, although it's far from agreed, that it constitutes one meaningful past, although our positionality and the narratios with which we express and explicate that past allows many different and equally valid understandings of it. But while I think these are issues with which we must grapple as a discipline, my presentation is also in some respects an allegory. Because no matter how predatory the present becomes, in reality, all we really know is the past. Look to the person beside you, an old and dear friend or a longtime colleague. Regard them as someone you hold in regard. Tomorrow, even today, they may be gone or the friendship may be past. Someday you will hear their name read from this podium, or they will hear yours. The certainties to which we cling may vanish in a moment in that wavefront of becoming that shifts now to then. Those values, understandings, and meanings are all regardant in the older heraldic sense of the term, of looking backward. And I would submit that our obligations are not extinguished by looking back, that our obligations to the dead are not simply as ancestors to the still living, who might hold us to account, but as people in their own right, meriting our regard. The past, not the present, encapsulates us, constrains us, informs us, instructs us in the best traditions of Historia Magistra Vitae, and in its worst traditions too. I would also suggest that the latter-day emphasis on presentism reflects both the narcissism and the profound insecurity of our present age. The past haunts us and hounds us not because it does not exist or because it makes no claims on us, but because it's the stuff of which we're made. It makes us who we are, and in the longer course of events defines who we will become and who we shall remain. And because we all know all too well that it will ultimately make one final claim on all of us, as a necessary and unavoidable part of becoming. Because of our own mortality and doubt in an age of uncertainty, we try to cannibalize the past to shore up the present, but in the end, the past devours us all the same. Thank you. Before you do anything, I have to do something first. All right? So this is also my chance for a brief valedictory message. As I hand over the gavel, I find I am more in love with anthropology in all of its fractious splendor than I was when I began. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the volunteer leaders of the association, the committee chairs, the work groups and task forces, the section leaders, the members of the various groups within the association, board members and officers for their time and talent. Thank the staff for their profound professionalism and patience, and all of you for this incomparable honor and opportunity. But about that gavel. Rather than handing on a nondescript gavel, I thought that while meeting in these storied lands, we could do just a little bit better. And I'd like to thank Sue Rowley for helping us commission a First Nations artist to create a ceremonial gavel for the association. Created by Ramsey Lewis of the Musqueam Nation, it's made of oak and antler instead of cedar. He deemed cedar too soft. And is decorated with eagle and raven motifs representing messengers and tricksters. Fitting symbols for our association, and the wry humor involved is fully appreciated. It's my pleasure to pass the gavel to Akhil Gupta, the association's new president.
It's beautiful.
We're adjourned.
Thank you, Alex, for a really thoughtful and philosophically deep and inspiring talk. I feel very fortunate to follow Alex Barker in the role of AAA president. Those of you who know Alex know that he has many superpowers, one of the many being that he listens to everyone with an open mind. But more importantly, he listens to them with an open heart. He's been a calm, steadying influence in many contentious situations. Not only is he characterized by a lack of drama, no drama Barker, he has the ability to miraculously prevent drama from happening in moments of tense meetings or difficult situations. So I could go on for a very long time talking about Alex's virtues, but I don't want to create a situation where I unwittingly create a contrast with what may happen with my own presidency. So all I will say in giving Alex some small gifts for his service is that we are all deeply in your debt for serving the AAA with such grace, wit, and wisdom. This is a plaque that is in his, given for his, I'll read it to you, presented to Alex Barker in recognition for his steadfast commitment to the mission of the American Anthropological Association and for his distinguished contribution to its program and services as president from 2017 to 2019 and as president-elect 2015 to 2017. I also have another small gift, which is Alex is very fond of fountain pens. So this gift is a certificate for him to get a really good fountain pen at the store that he likes the most for that purpose. So here's a gift for him.
And once again, thank you all. Please enjoy Vancouver. I appreciate you being here this evening, but surely there are better places for you to be. Thank you.
The meeting is adjourned.